Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Katie Halper. She's the host of The Katie Halper Show, and she's also a co-host of Useful Idiots. Thank you so much for coming on, Katie.
Thanks for having me.
So you actually have done extensive coverage in reference to Israel and Palestine. You've been talking about this issue for quite some time, and you yourself, you are Jewish. I want to start off with this because there's something I have been noticing since we've been covering this particular war. I'm starting to notice that some people have this idea that the Jewish faith and Zionism is the same thing. So I want to start with that. If you could explain the difference between practicing the Jewish faith and Zionism.
Sure. So that's a really important question. And it's actually even more complicated than the one you just asked, or not more complicated. I shouldn't say that. It's more multifaceted because I'm Jewish and I identify as Jewish, but I don't practice Judaism. So the Jewish faith isn't something that I have, let's say. There are a lot of secular Jews who identify as Jewish, and it's almost like when you're a Catholic Protestant, an Irish Catholic or Irish Protestant, it's almost like that. It's more kind of ethnic, which I know gets into a weird kind of area. But Jews, some Jews are Jewish because they're religious. I'm not that, but there's a whole like Jewish tradition of kind of radical leftism. There's even this term tikkun olam, which is Hebrew for repair the world. And that I think speaks to kind of why you do have this tradition of progressives among some Jews, but you also obviously have conservative Jews, both politically conservative and religiously conservative. But, you know, someone like Bernie Sanders, for instance, I don't think he's Jewish, right? But I don't think he celebrates I don't think he does Shabbat every Friday. I don't know if he identifies. But what's interesting is like it kind of didn't for Hitler and for the rest of the world, like it didn't really matter whether you were practicing or not, right? For Hitler, his definition was you had one Jewish grandparent. And I'm not trying to like use Hitler's definition to describe Jews, but I'm bringing that up because the world definitely treated you as a Jew regardless of your religion. Right. Does that make sense? It's a little bit,
right.
But what I will say is that being Jewish and having a Jewish identity does not make you a Zionist. And what's ironic is that the idea that you have to support Israel blindly because you're Jewish is actually an anti-Semitic trope in itself. So there's that stereotype of dual loyalty where Jews aren't really loyal to the country that they're living in. They're going to be loyal to Israel, the home of the Jews. People who use the term Jew and Zionist interchangeably, often anti-Semites will do that. They'll talk about the Zionist this, the Jewish that. And then, ironically, people like AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League or organizations like that, or lobbies like that, I should say, and people with their politics pretend that you have to be a Zionist. You have to be Zionist if you're Jewish. And they do that because they want to present anti-Zionism or even non-Zionism as anti-Semitic. And the truth is there is a long history of Jews. I mean, Zionism used to be unpopular among Jews. It's getting less popular again. But there's lots of different historical reasons that Zionism happened the way it happened. A large one being the Holocaust. But the other thing was that it was very much a part of imperialism. At first, it was a part of England's plan to have kind of a foothold in the Middle East. And then it was an American plan, depending on which time you're talking about. Time period.
That's really interesting. I think that's important for people to hear.
Yeah. So I'm Jewish, but I don't celebrate, like, I'm not kosher. I don't go to synagogue. I wasn't bat mitzvahed. But of course, I'm not saying any people who do that they're Jewish too. It's just they're different types of definitions of Jewishness. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. When I lived in New York, I lived in this neighborhood in Brooklyn called Midwood.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time, I didn't realize that, you know, when I was looking for apartments at the time, I didn't realize like that I guess they call them Hasidic Jewish neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I went to a pizza shop and I asked for a slice of pepperoni pizza and the guy told me.
Oh, that's really funny. Right.
He
Not
said, "You
kosher.
can't
Yeah.
have that."
That's really funny. Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's funny because like my mom, when she was younger, like Irish Catholic school kids would throw rocks at her and her brother. It's not funny actually, but it's just an example of how, and they weren't religious. They just knew, I guess, because my mom's family's name is Eisenberg, or maybe they just knew because of where they lived that they were Jewish. So it's an interesting thing about how I always find that identity interesting. But there really is an interesting, and I made this documentary called Commie Camp about the summer camp that I worked at, my mom worked at, my grandma worked at. And it was founded in the 1920s by Yiddish-speaking secular socialist and communist Jews. And people like Paul Robeson would visit, and Pete Seeger would visit. The Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, their sons sent their kids to the camp. And that there is a real rich tradition of radical Jewish radicalism.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And there's like Shalom Aleichem. I don't know if you know the musical Fiddler on the Roof. They have that song, If I Were a Rich Man. So apparently that's actually based on a poem by Shalom Aleichem, who was a Yiddish writer. And it's actually very different. It's like, if I were rich, I'd have to share with people. Like, it's a kind of very universalist message. That's totally different from the way they turn it into in the musical. But there's a real history of internationalism.
Wow, interesting. Now, I know Kim Iverson was here recently, and she was talking about her experience when she went to visit the West Bank and some of the things that she saw. And one of the things that she pointed out on the show was that based on her experience, this conflict between Israel and Palestine is not just about religion. And she pointed out that there are Palestinian Jews. There are also Ethiopian Jews that live there as well.
And there are Palestinian Christians.
Yep. Yeah.
Do
you consider this conflict to be a religious conflict, and why or why not?
So it's interesting because it gets back to kind of what we were saying at the beginning. I think that religion, for some people it is. For religious Zionists, it is religious conflict, and they think that this is where Jews are supposed to be. But and Israel's weird because it's secular kind of, but also not secular. You have to get married with you have to have a conservative rabbi marry you. You can't even, I think Orthodox, you can't even have like a Reform rabbi marry you. But, and things like shut down on Fridays. But Zionists were a mix. And like Theodore Herzl, who's considered the father of Zionism, wasn't religious. For lots of people, this has nothing to do with religion. It's for some people, it was having a safe place for Jews because of the pogroms and persecution. And then, of course, the Holocaust. And for a lot of people who came after the Holocaust, it wasn't necessarily an ideological thing. They just literally needed somewhere to go. But I think it's important to note that a lot of Jews opposed Zionism. They wanted Jews to be safe where they were. They thought that was the answer to improve their, where they were, not just leave and find a place where they'd be safe. And the problem is that whether or not you think that Jews deserve a safe place, Israel was founded, and you read this in the Zionist texts and in the letters and in their diaries. It was an imperial project that was kind of dovetailed between what the Zionist Jews wanted and what the British wanted, because the British were anti-Semites. They wanted Jews out, but Christian Zionism, I thought, was more recent than it is, but it's quite old. And Christians wanted Jews to go back to Israel also to fulfill a religious purpose. What's interesting is that most Zionists in America are actually Christian Zionists, just because their numbers are so big, so much bigger than Jewish numbers. But it isn't. It's a power. It's about rights and power, I would say. They're people who, again, like, I don't think Netanyahu is particularly religious, and a lot of the founders of Israel weren't religious. So I don't think it's a religious conflict. I think a lot of people who don't want to look at the historical material context want to pretend, oh, this is just a religious thing, and they've been fighting for thousands of years. And no, it's not that. And Jews and Muslims have coexisted in many instances. this is not about incompatible religions. This is about people being expelled from where they were. It's about ethnic cleansing, and it's about weaponizing what really was a tragedy and really was a horror, which is the Holocaust, and before that, the pogroms. What's so sad is that it weaponizes those things to ethnically cleanse other people. That's what's so upsetting. And I think what we're seeing are lots of Jews saying, "Not in my name," and our Jewish identity says, "Speak out against this. Never again is now." I went to a protest on Friday, arranged by Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, and it was really moving. And there were a bunch of Jews who were saying, "Never again is now. Ceasefire now." They see this as part of their Jewish identity, speaking out precisely because of what happened to their families. Norman Finkelstein is
Yeah, I've seen some of the videos Chuck Modi has. There's actually activists at Congress.
Today, right. Yeah, exactly. And, Norman Finkelstein is another example. His parents were Holocaust survivors. They survived concentration camps during the Holocaust. And he thinks that he says that Gaza is a concentration camp. Gabor Mate is a Holocaust survivor, and he told me during an interview, "Never again" isn't a tribal slogan. It means never again for anyone, not just for Jews. Miko Peled is a Jewish Israeli, son of a high-ranking general, grandson on his mom's side of one of the signatories to Israeli independence. His niece was tragically killed in a suicide bombing. And after she was killed, he was kind of like, what would make young Palestinian guys kill themselves and kill other people? Why would they do this? And he started to kind of dig into the history and the reality of Palestine. And that turned him into an activist for peace, not a radical hell-bent on revenge. And what the other sad thing is that none of this is making Jews safer. None of what Israel does makes Jews safer. Another irony about all of this. But yeah, I would say it's not a religious conflict. It's a political conflict. It's an occupation. It's a, ethnic cleansing. And if you read the people that doing this, they knew what they were doing, and they knew there had to be transference, as they called it, of people living there, because they wanted to be a Jewish majority, and they didn't have the numbers, so they had to get rid of the people there. They had this fake claim, a land without a people for people without a land. That's what they called Palestine, implying that there were no people there. What a great combination. A land without a people for people without a land, being the Jews. But of course, it was a land with people.
Yeah. I want to show you this from Loki. But Loki's been pretty good on this issue as well, I think. So Loki tweeted this. He said, at the UN Human Rights Committee, a huge number of the participants turned their backs on U.S. Ambassador Michelle Taylor in protest against Israel's bombing of Gaza. And so I just want to show this here. I'll just keep the volume down because it's kind of loud. But you'll see people here start to stand up and to turn their backs towards her. And I thought that this was really moving to see. And it's, of course, all different people, different races, understanding what's really happening over there. So I thought that's important for people to see. And I bring this up because it was brought to my attention, I believe about 2 years ago, that Human Rights Watch, they actually identified Israel as an apartheid state.
Yeah.
They accused Israel of crimes against humanity. But one of the things I noticed is most people I talk to in the U.S. are not aware of this, not even familiar with the Human Rights Watch. And also I've noticed that a lot of our political officials, our government in general, I feel that they don't even address that issue that the Human Rights Organization has brought up. Why do you feel that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So the Palestinians have, of course, been saying, and South Africans have been saying for decades that Israel is an apartheid state. And that's the video that I made when I was at the Hill that got me removed from the Hill, was a video basically defending Rashida Tlaib for saying that it was an apartheid state. And I went through why it's an apartheid state. And I quoted, in addition to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, B'Tselem, which is this Israeli human rights organization, and members of and what's interesting is I quoted former Israeli prime ministers who said that it either was apartheid or was going to be apartheid soon. Yeah, but as we're seeing from this, the U.S. stands by Israel unwaveringly, no matter what. It stands by them as they bomb civilian targets. It stands by them, and Joe Biden lies about having seen photos of beheaded babies. Yes. Israel is an ally. Joe Biden himself said in the 80s, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent one to protect our interests, to protect America's interests. So Israel is really seen as this foothold in the Middle East for the United States. There's a huge lobby. There's AIPAC. There's Christian Zionists, which is a very powerful lobby. Then you also have Israel selling nanotechnology for surveillance and weaponry. So the United States is very in bed with them on that. So these are the reasons, the various reasons. It has nothing to do with human rights, obviously. It's not like anyone who's serious about human rights knows that it's an apartheid state. But the United States gives it a blank check, which is why I'm so furious that people who are condemning Hamas aren't also condemning the U.S. government, because that actually is where we have power. Hamas is not going to listen to an American screaming, release the hostages. The American government may, with enough of us, feel political pressure to not fund, arm, morally support, legitimize what Israel's doing, this mass collective punishment, this genocide, this ethnic cleansing that Israel's engaging in right now as we speak.
What's really interesting, too, is the issue with Netanyahu. So he's right-wing extremist. I would say that Netanyahu, I think, is more right-wing than Donald Trump is, based on some of the things I've seen him say. He's also been caught in multiple lies in reference to the behavior that's happening in the state of Israel. And it seems like a lot of people also are not calling out the fact that we have Democrats, we have like people like Joe Biden who they're standing hand in hand and shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu, who is right wing, who does have these far right views. And at the same time, they are calling out the far right in the United States, but they're working together with far right abroad. And I don't understand why more people don't see the hypocrisy there and like this type of contradiction. Like, why aren't more people calling that out? Like, you are supporting someone who is far right. They're not in the United States, but you're still doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is this historian, Tony Judd, who died, but he was a brilliant historian. And he said that, I remember reading a piece of his predicting that American support of Israel was going to end because Netanyahu was so overtly right wing that it was, and fascistic, that it was American Jews, liberal Zionists would be too embarrassed to stand by Israel. But they kind of did. I mean, we're seeing a shift now, but that has more to do with demographics and age. I think maybe Netanyahu's helped open some people's eyes, maybe, but not. I don't think to the extent that you'd think. And that's because I think for some people, there's this term actually, PEP, progressive except for Palestine. And there's some people who are that. And of course, I don't think you can really be progressive if you're that. But you know what I mean? They identify as progressive or liberal, let's say. But whatever Israel does, it has the right to defend itself. And what's weird is that I don't know if you've been seeing this response, but people are like, well, what the U.S. would respond if we were attacked? It's like, yeah, and I'd be out in the streets protesting what the U.S. would do. And I was out in the streets protesting what the U.S. did, not just with Iraq, which I was, but also in Afghanistan. So people pointing to Afghanistan and Iraq, one war, the Iraq war, being totally illegal based on lies, and the Afghanistan war being, I think, unjust and obviously a disaster, which didn't just kill hundreds of thousands of people, these two wars, but they also created much more terrorism and made America much less safe. So I think that I do think that some people, I think Abby Martin has spoken about this. I think it's her that I'm thinking of, that some people became uncomfortable because Trump and Bibi were so close. I think some liberals found that a little bit hard to square.
Yeah, I could see that. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But that's the other thing too. I want people to understand that even if Biden wasn't in office and Trump was in office, Donald Trump would still stand beside Netanyahu.
100%. He moved he did something that that Biden I don't think would have done, which is he moves the embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I remember that. One of the things I often wonder about people like yourself, Aaron, Norm Finkelstein, who are very vocal about this particular issue. Do you ever face any type of criticism from within your own community, from the Jewish community? And do you feel like more people in the United States actually understand, or more Jewish people in the US understand what's actually happening over there?
It's funny. Sometimes people will call me Capo, Kapo, which is like, I guess, the Jewish inmates who were stand-ins for guards. So it means like a sellout. So I get that. Then someone tweeted at me today, like in Hebrew, but I translated it. Google Translate was like, sometimes I think the only thing with these people is to send them dick pics, which I thought was funny. I do get that, but I also have been, it's been nice. I've gotten messages from other Jews or non-Jews and from Palestinians, which is very, nice to hear. Not that they owe it to me, but like that some people have thanked me for speaking out, because I think that it's so important, given how so many people like cynically weaponize anti-Semitism to justify ethnic cleansing. I think it's really important to show people that you can be a Jew who's critical of Israel. And in fact, for some of us, it's like part of our Jewish identity, as I kind of alluded to earlier on. Max Blumenthal is another one, very critical of Israel, Jewish. So I feel pretty, and I also should mention I have family in Israel. So, which is, it doesn't complicate it though. I mean, it makes it, in other words, I mourn for the victims of Hamas's attack, and nothing that happened that day makes me want collective punishment for the people of Gaza, which isn't that hard to reconcile those two things. I mean, I'm the country that the side of the conflict, and it's not a conflict, it's an occupation. So the power that is being backed by the United States is obviously Israel. So that's the one that I'm speaking out against. Like speaking out against funding, because the U.S. has all this blood on its hands now. And it's really, as we speak, like children are being killed, civilians are being killed. I think now it's probably even more, but 1,000 kids were killed. And I don't get how people can just turn away from this pain and suffering. Like, I don't know if they've just been so conditioned that we need to do this to be safe, that there's all this propaganda, the idea that these people just want to kill all the Jews, as opposed to people being angry with the people who took their land.
Yep.
And when they say these people, they don't mean Hamas, they mean Palestinians. And we've seen Israeli officials make it clear that they don't see a difference. The Israeli president actually said that they aren't this rhetoric of civilians doesn't make sense because they voted for Hamas. First of all, the last election was 2006. But even so, I mean, okay, children are what about children? Not that I think voting for Hamas should be a death sentence either, but let's just say, okay, according to your argument, how do you square that with the children? And you've seen Israeli officials, like one of them, a member of parliament, called for another Nakba. The Nakba is the disaster in Arabic, and it's when the Palestinians were pushed out and killed in 1948 and ethnically cleansed. And an Israeli official said it was time for another Nakba. You saw Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted this really scary racist thing about like children of the light versus children of the dark. They're not hiding their intentions. That's what makes it so scary, is that they're saying these things out loud. And then if they're asked about civilians, like Naftali Bennett, who is a previous, who was the last prime minister of Israel, was asked about civilians. Are you really asking me about Palestinians? Shame on you. Shame on you. And then they're like, what if it was your family? And then they compare them to Nazis. There are a couple of things that they're recycling. I saw another woman, like an ambassador, being asked by a British journalist, what about the humanitarian disaster? And she went from saying there is no humanitarian disaster to saying, well, it's Hamas's fault, to saying these are Nazis, to saying, what would you do if your children were kidnapped or killed? It's just awful. And you have hospital. I mean, Israel has historically bombed hospitals. It has a history of bombing hospitals. It bombs ambulances that come to pick up people who have been injured. It bombs, UN sites. It's bombed hospitals with Doctors Without Borders in it. Today, it bombed a UN site, or today or yesterday. This is not surgical precision. Or if it's surgical precision, it's surgical precision to kill indiscriminately. That's what it's being used for.
It's such a mess. I have to say, I was very proud of all the young people that I saw like protesting, because that gives me a lot of hope that they're the ones, and they're the future, and they really understand what's happening. So I've been really like proud of them, even though some of the students at Harvard University that wrote that letter, they've had their future careers threatened because they wrote that letter. It's just, this is a very scary thing that you can't even just speak up.
Well, it shows you how much they're losing the war of public opinion, that they have to try to make protests like they're doing this in Europe too. You can't have a Palestinian flag. You can't have a protest. It shows what a weak spot they're in some ways, they being the Zionist lobby. But they still have a lot of power, political control, well-funded. But we have the people. So we just have to make sure that we leverage that.
How do you feel this will impact the 2024 presidential election? Do you feel that this war with Israel and Palestine, that this is going to be a big issue going into 2024? And do you feel like that can sway voters either way? Because I have seen some of the RFK supporters, like Kim Iverson herself, they have pulled back their support from RFK because, at least I feel, he's incredibly horrible on this issue. So for some people, it is a deal breaker, like if they're not right on this issue. And for others, I've heard them make statements that I'm only worried about what's happening domestically. I'm not focused on foreign policy, which is, I say foreign policy is domestic policy, right. Like these things go together. But do you think this is going to impact the 2024 presidential election?
I think maybe some people will sit out because they're so disgusted by Biden's handling of this. I've seen some people tweet that. But the sad thing is that the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue is just that Democrats pretend to care about, pay lip service to human rights, and Republicans don't even pay lip service. And I heard, like we had talked about this today on Useful Idiots on our Thursday Throwdown, which you can find at usefulidiotspod.com. Rick Scott, the Florida Republican senator, was disgusted by Biden talking about humanitarian crises, like literally disgusted. That is the discourse. Like, you get to stand by Israel and pretend to care about Palestinian human rights a little bit, like pretend a little bit, not even that much, or you get to stand by Israel and openly vilify Palestinians.
How do you think this will affect someone like Rashida Tlaib? I feel like they're really pressuring her to basically hide who she is.
Right. I think she's very popular in her district, so hopefully she'll be safe. But she's been very outspoken. She's someone who, I think it's like, it is so racist, the discourse and the framing, that anyone who is either Muslim American or Arab American or Palestinian American is, I think, rightly horrified. I mean, every time someone sends a message out in solidarity with Israel, or even if it's just for the victims of Hamas, and they don't mention the victims of Israel, they're basically telling that group of people that they either don't exist or don't matter. Or worse.
That's right.
And we saw those 3, apparently, I don't know what, like, MSNBC has denied it, but apparently these 3 Muslim American journalists were benched from anchoring their own shows.
Yep.
It's
one of them being Mehdi Hassan.
Yeah, right. Imagine if if a network had only 3 Jewish anchors and they were benched because of current events.
Yep. How do you feel about where RFK stands on this issue? Because I have to say, it goes back to, I think the first interview I saw with him that gave me pause was the Glenn Greenwald interview about this topic. And I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. And then I saw the interview that he did on the Jimmy Dore show. And I said to myself, it was hard to continue to watch it because he was smearing Palestinian people.
Yeah.
And that was very upsetting to me. And I just thought to myself, like, what is his deal? Because I feel like
he's been sat down by AIPAC or some Israel lobby and been fed the talking points. Everything from, he was trying to make the point that they have good LGBTQ rights, which is funny because he said transvestites. I think he meant transgender people. But he obviously feels like to win the election or to be, do well, he needs to not upset the Jewish lobby. And it really does. I mean, his analysis of Ukraine is so spot on. It's very weird to hear someone who understands what's happening in Ukraine and sees this as a proxy war have no understanding or willful, dishonest misrepresentation of what's happening in the Middle East.
I also think it's really interesting that Dennis Kucinich just stepped down from his campaign, and we know where Dennis stands on this issue.
Yeah, I was wondering how Dennis was tolerating that, honestly.
That's interesting. All right, Katie, I have one more question for you. So one of the things that I think a lot of us were disappointed to see is that you did not get the opportunity to, air your story about Israel and Palestine on The Hills Rising. But I did get to see it on, I think it was Breakthrough News feature it on there. So I did get to see it, and I thought it was very informative. Thanks. And I think back to, if only that would have happened on Rising, because it's over 1 million subscribers. Yeah. And I've seen some of the comments since this topic has been covered that is very clear to me that a lot of people are just really not aware of the history and what's been happening in Israel. So it's unfortunate that you didn't get that opportunity to air that story, because I think it would have been very educational for people. But the question I have is that, do you think, looking back on it, if you did get to feature that story on Rising, do you think it would have made a difference considering where we are today with the war?
Maybe. I mean, maybe more people would have been able to see through Israel's propaganda once they realized that all their talk of being a beacon of democracy was actually just garbage and not true. I think, I'd like to think that maybe people seeing that would make them more critical and questioning of what Israel says and what Israel does, and realizes that when they say they're doing things in the name of democracy, they're not. So, yeah. But I want to give Bree a shout out for fighting the good fight. Yeah, I think one of the things is that because I made a noise about them not letting me do that monologue, and then they banned me and fired me and pretended it was not for ideological reasons, that makes it, I think, that much harder for them to censor. I think that means that Bree can be strong on this issue without facing consequences, hopefully. Because if they did, then they'd be admitting that they were lying when they said it wasn't over ideological reasons, which Bree also debunked. And I don't think anyone who watches the show thinks that it was for anything other than that.
Right. Because that's what I was saying. Like, they've been covering it, quite frequently. And I'm just like, okay, so you could have let Katie air her story.
Yeah, it's kind of like Mark Lamont Hill getting fired from CNN, but then Peter Beinart coming on.
Yeah.
So, there's only so many people you can, I guess, try to punish for speaking out about this. And Mark Lamont Hill had such an amazing interview with someone from the Israeli government where he actually asked the question that very few people are being asked. It's happening little by little now, but, so you're okay with collective punishment?
Yep. Yep. Well, I've learned a lot from you actually, and Aaron as well. One of the recent segments of Useful Idiots, where Aaron had talked about that Arab 2002 peace initiative.
Right.
I'd never heard of that before, so that was news to me. And then I started reading about that, and so I've learned a lot. And I think more people just need to be educated about this issue.
Yeah. I agree.
All right, Katie. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.